West Bank these past few weeks have been large-scale demonstrations by Palestinians to protest the carnage in Gaza and the crackdown of rights in East Jerusalem. At least 27 Palestinians have been killed since May 10th by Israeli forces, and thousands have been injured. The 2,007 million Palestinians on the West Bank live in 167 fragmented islands of land, separated from the world and each other by Israeli checkpoints, walls, settlements, and settler-only roads. Their collective future is being devoured before their eyes by the 240 Israeli settlements expanding on their lands. Palestinian Excellencies, this is not a Palestinian state in the making. This is an occupation that has become indistinguishable from occupation. The European Union has called this subjugation a one-state reality of unequal rights. Respected human rights organizations are now calling this apartheid. Excellencies, last week I joined a number of other special rapporteurs in calling for the violence in the past weeks in Palestine to be investigated by the International Criminal Court. I repeat that call today. Excellencies, over the past dozen years, the Human Rights Council has commissioned 4 major independent reports on the human rights situation in occupied Palestine, all initiated in the shadow of yet another round of extreme violence, with the casualties overwhelmingly on the Palestinian side. The constant theme in each of these 4 reports violations of human rights and humanitarian laws by Israel, along with a prevailing culture of exceptionalism and impunity. Time allows me to cite only one of these reports. The report on the violence in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, sometimes known as the Goldstone Report, stated that justice and respect for the rule of law are the indispensable basis for peace. The prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory that warrants action, unquote. 12 years later, these words sting because they describe so acutely today that which has been allowed to continue to fester unchallenged and unchanged. All 4 of these reports have asked, where is accountability? I ask, do we not have enough evidence and enough reports to conclude that Israel will not end its occupation without decisive international action grounded in the framework of rights? Excellencies, now that the last missiles and rockets have been fired and the tears from the last funerals are slowly drying, accountability must rise to the top of the international agenda and of this council. We must insist upon a brand new diplomatic playbook to end the Israeli occupation, one that is centered on rights rather than realpolitik. The various peace initiatives over the past 3 decades, from the 1993 Oslo Declaration of Principles to the 2020 Trump Plan for Peace for Prosperity Plan, or entirely outside of the framework of international law and human rights. This has allowed Israel to make the core issues of self-determination, annexation, and settlements negotiable issues, rather than issues of profound illegality from which Israel must completely desist. This has enabled Israel to negotiate from the strength of its many illegal facts on the ground, rather than from the framework of fundamental rights and legal duties. And this is the overriding reason why so many of these peace initiatives have failed. The simple reality is that the occupation has become as entrenched and as sustainable as it has because the international community has never imposed meaningful costs on Israel for acting as an inquisitive and defiant occupying power. Accordingly, I urge that the Human Rights Council's future work on the Israeli occupation must be guided by these 3 principles. 1, the diplomatic framework for fully ending the occupation is to be found within the framework of international law and human rights, not in realpolitik. 2, Israel has become a bad faith occupier, and it is magical thinking to believe that its occupation will not end unless and until meaningful accountability measures have been imposed. And three, because of the vastly asymmetrical differences in power between Israel and the Palestinians, active international intervention is indispensable. Excellencies, in conclusion, if we are not to meet again in yet another special session in a year or 3 years from now to lament yet another round of appalling violence in Palestine, then decisive steps must be taken now to fully end the occupation. Accountability is the key that can alone unlock the titanium cage that is the occupation. On behalf of the Coordination Committee and myself, I wish you every success in your indispensable work.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Issam Yunus, Director for Al Maizan Center for Human Rights in Gaza and the head of the Independent Commission for Human Rights of Palestine. Mr. Yunus, you have the floor on video.
And in Sheikh Jarrah, this now goes back 14 days in a far more severe manner because the area is illegally sealed off. And we have no idea why. We, the residents of this suburb, can only go out with all of our ID papers, but no loved ones, no friends, nobody can get into this area. Unfortunately, says the interpreter, the audio has become inaudible. It returns. So we have been cut off once again. We have no solidarity to support us, while settlers, on the other hand, are able to move freely. The colonial violence we have suffered, which the occupying forces are using against us, Palestinians who have been struck and arrested during peaceful demonstrations, is extreme and barbaric. In the Sheikh Jarrah suburb, where we've demonstrated peacefully to call for our rights to our lands, to the areas of the city where we've been born, we have been suppressed. We are fired upon by using rubber bullets, not only in the streets, but in our homes, in our houses. Some days ago, a child of 11 years of age, Jana Al-Kashwani, was shot at using rubber bullets while she was at home in her house. Police officers demanded that they come into her home. She had done nothing. She accepted those orders, let them into her house, and when she turned her back, she was shot at with rubber bullets. Today, she's suffering from her injuries. These are barbaric attacks which target us on a daily basis. The speaker cannot be heard again.
To the American airbase. Günther Schneider is not fighting on his own.
Sheikh Jarrah violates human rights and international law. We are in the process of seeing a substitution of one ethnic group with another. These are war crimes. What is happening in Palestine, and more precisely in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is a war crime. It's a war crime which has been committed on a number of occasions. Forced displacement is a war crime. Ethnic cleansing is also a war crime. And according to international law, Israel has no sovereignty in East Jerusalem. And I repeat, this is pursuant to international law, but Israel has no respect for that and cannot be dissuaded. The colonial courts are completely unfair and sentences are skewed in favour of the settlers. All of the systems and infrastructure are brought to bear to support the settlers in Palestinian areas. The settler organisations which are trying to take over Sheikh Jarrah lands have no property rights underpinning their actions. There is also a complicity between the occupying state and the settlers themselves. By way of example, 2 days ago, there were 2 settlers. The sound has been lost. Unfortunately, we do not hear the speaker. Another break in the sound. We have there was a slogan that we had written that saying "You are welcome in Sheikh Jarrah suburb," which was rubbed out, and the settlers considered those who were behind it as undertaking racist acts, which was completely wrong. We've done nothing against the settlers, quite the opposite. They were received warmly and welcomed, and the municipality tried to send out civil servants in order to rub out what we'd written, the welcoming messages we'd written, in order to make the settlers feel welcome. But the settlers decided to delete them, to erase them. Why are the municipalities rubbing out what we've written on the walls of our homes? It exacerbates the apartheid racial segregation which is meted out against us. I'd like to also briefly touch on the matter of my own house specifically. In 2000, my father decided to add an annex to our house. The sound is lost. My father asked for a permit from the municipality to construct. This was rejected, unfortunately. 94% of permits for building are rejected because those requests are submitted by Palestinians, above all in Jerusalem. My father had built a house. He should have been entitled to build an annex because he'd been married and had had children, and the space was insufficient for that size of family. But he was surprised to see that the judge himself came to our house. He came to our house and closed the house, saying that it had been built without any authorization. So for 9 years, the house was completely shut up. We've been looking at this house and dreaming about living there. We've paid around 100,000 shekels of fines as a result of this erroneous judgment. 9 years later, we were surprised to see that there was an iniquitous decision taken by the colonial court saying that Israeli settlers could move into that house, despite the fact that allegedly it hadn't had any permit to build it, according to them. The occupying forces suddenly decided it was completely legal for the settlers to live there. And so since 2009, I've been sharing my own house with settlers. That's my own personal story in Sheikh Jarrah suburb, but it's also the story of 500 people who have always lived in that part of town, large families with children and grandchildren. We've never wanted to leave our homes. We didn't want to live in the street, but there was no alternative for us. We wanted to stay in our homes. This flies in the face of international law and the principles of humanitarianism. What's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and everywhere in Palestine falls into that category. The occupation must stop as soon as possible. Palestinians are entitled to live in peace and security in our country, Palestine, from the river to the sea.
I thank you for your statement. We will now hear from the countries concerned, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel. You have 5 minutes, and you're speaking on Zoom. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam President, the day of judgment by the Jews. This is written in the Charter of Hamas, the jihadist genocidal terrorist organization. These are not just words. Cement that should be used to build hospitals and schools for Palestinians, and instead uses it to dig terror tunnels. These are the words of a terrorist organization that has taken the Palestinian people, women and children, and used them as human shields to conceal its rockets. These are the words of a terrorist organization who calls for all Muslims to fight the Jews and kill them. Madam President, over 11 days, starting on May 10th, this terrorist organization fired more than 4,400 rockets at Israeli civilians. The rockets were fired by Hamas from Palestinian homes, hospitals, and schools. Each one of these rockets constitute a war crime. Each one of these rockets constitute a tragedy. I want to ask member states participating in today's session, what would you do if rockets were fired at Dublin, Paris, or Madrid? How would you respond if terrorists attacked Beijing, Islamabad, or Moscow? Madam President, what will be presented today by many countries is a failure, is a false moral equivalence. As a matter of fact, an immoral equivalence between Israel, a democracy that seeks peace and abides by international law, and a murderous extreme terrorist organization. Hamas fire rockets indiscriminately targeting civilians to kill as many innocent people as possible. Israel takes all steps to adhere to the principle of distinction, proportionality, and necessity. We do so not only because of our obligation under the law of armed conflict, but also it is our moral duty to protect innocent lives. During the recent conflict, Israel took all measures to protect civilians. Yet sadly, despite our of hiding behind civilians. Madam President, let me be clear. Hamas initiated this conflict. It purposely raised tension in Jerusalem to justify its attack. Anyone who uses Jerusalem as some sort of an excuse for Hamas's action only legitimizes the use of terror. In fact, Israel did everything to diffuse the tension. The Israeli government took the exceptional decision to ask the Supreme Court to postpone the hearing over Sheikh Jarrah. We rerouted our annual Jerusalem Day parade. We even took the extraordinary steps of preventing Jews from entering their holiest site, Temple Mount. What did Hamas do? It launched 4,400 rockets on Israeli cities. Madam President, since the Council inception, 30% of all special sessions have targeted Israel. Instead of the Council being a moral voice, unequivocally stating that Israel has the right to defend itself and condemning Hamas for the terrorist activities, we have witnessed a ritual where Israel is targeted and singled out. It does not matter what are the facts and what is the reality on the ground. Make no mistake, Israel is not immune to criticism, and we have the proper mechanism to ensure accountability. Failure to condemn Hamas in today's session will almost as well as other terrorist organizations around the world to use innocent people as human shields. So member states must decide today. You have to make a decision. Are you pro-Palestinian or pro-Hamas? You cannot be both. You cannot be pro-Palestinian if you do not condemn Hamas for firing rockets at civilians in Israel. You cannot be pro-Palestinian if you do not condemn Hamas for using its own people, the Palestinian people, as human shields. You cannot be pro-Palestinian if you continue to allow Hamas to use international aid to build terror infrastructure beneath schools, residential buildings, and hospitals. Madam President, 4 days ago, the Secretary General of Fatah, Jibril Rajoub, saluted the acts of terror carried out by Hamas. By doing so, he saluted a terrorist organization that has carried out war crimes against both Israelis and Palestinians. By convening the special session today, the Palestinian Authority has chosen to reward Hamas for its action and encourage it further. Madam President, that is the choice that all member states have to make today. They can choose to embolden and reward Hamas, or they can choose to care for the Palestinian people. They can choose to stand with a terrorist organization that glorifies death, or with a democracy that cherishes life. My country has chosen. We will continue to defend our people while adhering to international law and the morals which guide us. Now it's up to you. What is your choice? I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the State of Palestine. You have 5 minutes. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
أنا؟ Okay. السيدة
President of the Human Rights Council, Madam High Commissioner, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we come back to your distinguished council in this special session as we bid farewell to our martyrs, care for our wounded, and sweep a new barbaric aggression on our people, our children and women. An aggression instigated and led by Israel before the eyes of the whole world. The Israeli war machinery and terrorism of its settlers continue to target our children who face murder, arrest, and displacement, deprived of a future in which they can live in peace and security. Of 260 martyrs, there were over 66 children, 39 women. In addition to the wounded and the displaced, thousands of buildings were destroyed. A new aggression encouraged by the policies that give impunity to a cowardly, racist regime that kills children and violates all rules of international law. Here, we stress that the inaction of the international community to hold occupation accountable until now, the sound broke. This has encouraged it to continue perpetrating crimes and expanding its colonialism and the establishment of an apartheid regime that is based on oppressing the Palestinian people from the river to the sea. In spite of all that, some continue to cover up for the crimes of the occupation, adopting its false rhetoric and sometimes equating between the victim and the executioner and ignoring our legitimate rights. Madam President, we would like to thank and express our deep gratitude to the states that have allowed the holding of this special session. We meet today as our people still faces crimes and continuous aggression since the first catastrophe, or Nakba, of 1948, and occupation since 1967. Israel, the occupation and apartheid authority, continues its crimes, its policies, and laws to consolidate a colonial and apartheid system based on the forced displacement of our people and based on a smaller Palestinian demography and a larger Israeli geography. This is what it is doing in occupied Jerusalem by bringing in settlers instead of the original inhabitants in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, and other neighborhoods in order to Judaize the sacred city. The aggressions have reached Al-Aqsa Mosque, the noble sanctuary, and Muslim worshippers during the holy month of Ramadan. And prior to that, while the Christians amongst our people were celebrating Easter in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Israel has used all its tools, its settlers, its occupation army, and their slogans used in historic Palestine shows its true face. They were screaming, "Death to Arabs, death to Arabs." It wants to increase its expansion of settlements and to change the demographics of the occupied Palestinian territory, including Jerusalem. In the absence of accountability, what Israel is doing, ladies and gentlemen, is not an exercise of a right that it does not have as an occupying power to defend itself, as it says. It is consolidating its colonialism. We refuse these false pretenses. We refuse to equate between the colonizer and the colonized. This distorts all the truth. Israel is an occupation power and therefore has obligations. The right to self-defense and the right to resist occupation is a right that we have, the Palestinian people. As any free people, we sought to defend our land, our right to life, to defend our holy sites and our right, and we believe in victory. However, like any colonial system, we have seen on live TV the response using murder and destruction and execution of full families. We have seen live testimonies of the soldiers of occupation who shelled the buildings in Gaza. They said that shelling the tall buildings in Gaza was venting their frustration. Madam President, we have to go back to the original story. The colonial Israeli occupation is the root of the problem of the suffering. It is the root of crimes and aggression. If we want to deal with all these issues in a sustainable manner, we must deal with this system, all of it, boycott it, prevent its products and companies working there, and to impose political and economic sanctions, and to impose accountability until it is dismantled. Settlers must be put on the list of terrorists. The Secretary General of the UN said, and I quote, "If there is hell on earth, it's the life of children in Gaza today." Yes, this hell has a name. It is called the Israeli occupation and its crimes. Madam President, we can all face this hell and end it by ending the apartheid and colonial Israeli system, by allowing our people to exercise its inalienable rights. Firstly, the right to self-determination and independence of the State of Palestine, the return of the refugees. We can put an end to this hell with a real international will based on international law, international legitimacy, and this Council. On this day, I call on you today to support the draft resolution before you today to urgently establish an independent commission to investigate all violations and look into the root causes and to present recommendations to avoid impunity and guarantee accountability. Madam President, there is no justice without justice for the Palestinian people and accountability for the war criminals. There is no peace without the end of occupation. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I will now turn to the list of speakers, and before I do so, I understand that the quality of the sound is indifferent and sketchy. It may be helpful while we try to resolve this issue to use headsets if you are speaking or listening on Zoom. Allow me also to recall the established time limits of 2 minutes and 30 seconds for council members and 1 minute and 30 seconds for observers. I am advised by the Secretariat that some dignitaries have sent video statements which exceed the time limits. I am prepared to show flexibility because of the level of the dignitary speaking. However, this should not set a precedent, and I will urge the Secretariat in the future not to accept statements which exceed the prescribed duration. Please note that the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I commence with a list of speakers for member states of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia. She will speak by video.
Disturbed by the increase in violence committed against the Palestine in the past few weeks. The latest violence of international human rights and humanitarian law by the occupying power, triggered by protests against the unlawful eviction of Palestinians from their home, is yet another example in a long list of events where the Palestinian people have been subjected to violence in their attempt to assert their legitimate rights, including their right to self-determination. Those violations of international human rights and humanitarian law over the years have been committed with full impunity, and the convening of this special session today with its intended outcome is a welcome step to hold perpetrators accountable for international crime of its pre-preliminary nature that have been committed on the territory of Palestine. Madam President, in its attempt to address the Israel-Palestine conflict, the international community should denounce the apartheid practices that are being employed by the Israel to operate and maintain its dominancy over the Palestinian people. Thus, while welcoming the decision of the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes within its material scope that might have been committed on the territory of Palestine, we urge the International Criminal Court to include the crime against humanity of apartheid in its investigation. Namibia welcomes the announcement of a ceasefire between Hamas and the occupied power on Friday, 21st May 2021. We, however, call on the occupied power to immediately restore civilian homes and infrastructure in Gaza, destroyed in breach of the international humanitarian laws, rules of necessity and proportionality. All these responsible for the discriminatory killings of civilians should also be held accountable. In conclusion, Madam President, Namibia reiterates its position that long and lasting comprehensive peace can only be achieved by upholding the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people through the creation of a two-state in accordance with relevant United Nations resolution. Their status as people entitled to exercise their rights to self-determination is well entrenched under international law. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh, who will speak on Zoom. You have the floor.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Madam President, we thank you for convening this special session. Once again, we witness blatant aggression and atrocities unleashed by the occupying power in the Palestinian territories. The large-scale brutal military actions led to the deaths of many civilians, nearly one-third of whom are children. The indiscriminate Israeli attacks destruction of buildings and infrastructures, including schools, hospitals, mosques, homes and media outlets. Clearly, the cycle of impunity, coupled with the subdued response of international community, have encouraged the occupying forces to commit repeated violations of human rights. We strongly condemn Israel's illegal and belligerent actions against the Palestinians. We express our condolences to the bereaved families of the victim. Madam President, the recent ceasefire must not be an excuse for us to cast off the weight of responsibility from our shoulders. The history shows that such ceasefire will not end the everyday sufferings of the people in the occupied Palestinian territory that has been going on for more than 7 decades. Hence, the following actions must be prioritized. First, Israel must end its continued illegal occupation, unlawful settlement activities and annexation. Second, international community must ensure to render badly needed humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians and must rebuild Gaza. Third, the Council should take decisive actions towards ensuring accountability and justice for all violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory, including through dispatching a commission of inquiry. The ICC should step up action to ensure accountability. Fourth, UN system-wide coordinated approach is needed. UN Security Council must lead by meaningful and decisive actions. And finally, the Council should step up its efforts to address the root causes of the crisis and find a lasting solution. Afterwards, now and tomorrow. Madam President, recently our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina wrote a letter to the President Mahmoud Abbas expressing our continuous support for the Palestinian brothers and sisters. I would reiterate her call for creation of a sovereign, an independent and viable state of Palestine with its Jerusalem as its capital, living in harmony and peace side by side with the state of Israel. Thank you very much. Joy Bangla.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Pakistan, who will speak on video.
As the apex UN body, this council is mandated to guard human rights and human dignity. Today's special session, requisitioned by 70 countries, is an exercise of this important mandate. The people of Palestine have once again faced relentless onslaught on their rights and dignity in 2 weeks of brutal Israeli aggression. This violent repression compounds 4 aspects of the perpetual Palestinian tragedy in 7 decades of illegal occupation. 1. Continuous killing of civilians, disproportionately affecting the vulnerable, including women and children. 2. Continuing Israeli settlement activity as a driver and force multiplier of occupation and violence. 3. Indiscriminate demolition of houses, hospitals, and schools, causing innumerable hardships to the people. 4. Recurring forced displacements, making people as refugees in their own land. The 2-week aggression also ignited violence and communal attacks against Palestinians in Israel, calling into question the tall claims of democracy and rule of law. Condoning to such violations only breeds arrogance and impunity. False equivalence between the victim and the aggressor on account of political expediency is patently incorrect and morally reprehensible. This Council must act to rectify the wrong. This Council must ensure realization of Palestinians' fundamental rights, right to life and right to self-determination. This Council must hold the aggressor accountable through international inquiry. Pakistan supports the Council's deliberations and decisions in accordance with merits of the human rights situation in Palestine. We urge others to do likewise. I thank you.
I understand that Israel has moved a point of order in relation to a comment that has been made on the chat function of the Zoom room. I have been read the comment on the chat function. I find it inappropriate, and I have asked the Secretariat to exclude the person who put the chat function in from the Zoom room. I thank you, and I now move on to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the Government of National Unity of Libya, and she will speak by video statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to commend the efforts by your Council to organize this special session in response to the OIC request and the Palestinian request, and with great support, and that in order to face the repression faced by our Palestinian brethren in the occupied territories and Eastern Jerusalem. And from this rostrum, I appeal to the international community to take urgent measures to protect the Palestinian people and to condemn the Israeli attack, of which Gaza is the victim, as well as other Palestinian cities, and to put an end to the systematic and continued violations that the Palestinian people is suffering of now for a number of decades. And also, we call upon foregoing the arbitrary policies of the occupation authorities that have transgressed all boundaries. My country also condemns the scorched earth policy that is adopted by the occupation authorities in Palestine, leaving behind victims, tens of children, women, and elderly persons, in addition to hundreds of wounded persons. This was an arbitrary, brutal campaign in which all forms of weapons were utilized. My country also condemns all the acts of aggression against holy places, Christian and Muslim holy places, as well as the condemnation of all the attempts to Judaize the eastern Jerusalem city, the storming by settlers of Al-Aqsa Mosque, preventing worshippers from exercising their religious rituals. And we have to underline that we cannot equate the occupied and the occupier, because here we are facing a state that is utilizing excessive force and violence and refuses to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other human rights mechanisms. We cannot equate between the aggressor and the victim. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, at the time we commend all international efforts by the Human Rights Council to deepen the prevention of impunity and to encourage the Commission of Inquiries to prosecute all those responsible for those violations. We also hope that the same measures will be taken and there will be accountability for the war crimes that is committed by Israel. We call upon this distinguished council to establish a neutral and impartial organ and to strengthen fighting impunity, as well as to strengthen human rights and to achieve lasting peace regionally and internationally. Madam, my country calls upon the United Nations and other organizations to take all necessary measures for us to move from the stage of appealing for justice concerning the question of Palestine and to enter into active measures to strengthen the principle of responsibilities and legal commitments individually and collectively, especially after the recent declaration by the ICC in which it said that the occupied Palestinian territories do fall within its jurisdiction. This in itself could pave the way towards establishing humanitarian justice that the Palestinian people have been aspiring to, and to ensure the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, putting an end to the occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian sovereign state with its capital in East Jerusalem. I thank you, Madam.
I thank you, and I advise all delegations that the list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt on behalf of the group of Arab states on video statement.
Madam President, it is my honor to make this statement on behalf of the Arab group who called for the convening of this special session. The Arab group strongly condemns the Israeli blatant aggression on Palestinians in East Jerusalem, especially in the Damascus Gate and in the Haram al-Sharif during the month of Ramadan, as well as the vicinity of the St. Sepulchre Church. Many Palestinian families are being threatened with displaced with forcible displacement, as well as provocation by Israeli officials and right-wing groups under the protection of police in Israel. The Arab group condemns the Israeli continued attacks and aggression against Gaza Strip that targeted densely populated areas that led to the killing of 240 civilians, including 66 children and thousands of wounded, and the targeting of schools and hospitals. Shelters and schools that are controlled by UNRWA have been also targeted and have been densely populated, and that exacerbates the COVID-19 pandemic. The international community not taking action to put Israel to account, to hold Israel to account, has facilitated the killing of Palestinian civilians. Therefore, the Arab group calls on the international community to urgently put an end to massacres perpetrated against the Palestinian people. We hold Israel, the occupying power, directly responsible for the consequences of this criminal aggression against the Palestinian people, particularly in the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. We reiterate our call to the international community to conduct an investigation and to hold Israel as accountable in East Jerusalem and Gaza for its aggressions. We call the member countries to be on the right side of history and to save Palestinian innocent lives by voting for the resolution that is submitted to this session. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the OIC.
Madam President, the OIC member states that requested this special session strongly condemn Israel's recent military aggression, use of lethal force against peaceful protesters, and state-sponsored settler violence against the Palestinian people. We also deplore unacceptable actions by the occupation forces, including unauthorized entry into Al-Aqsa Mosque, use of force, and undermining the sanctity of the places of worship during the holy month of Ramadan. The OIC condemns the growing pace of illegal evictions and demolition of Palestinian homes and properties. The sheer scale of civilian deaths, destruction, and displacement in occupied Palestinian territory is another sober reminder that global inaction has sustained a disturbing pattern of impunity for willful violation of international law by the occupation power. Regrettably, the self-professed global champions of human rights continue to shield the occupier from global accountability and literally provide arms and ammunition for its widely reported war crimes and crimes of apartheid against the Palestinian people. Let us be clear, there is no legal and moral equivalence between the occupier and the occupied. Madam President, despite ceasefire, Israeli colonial occupation and policy of ethnic cleansing continues. We call for result-oriented global efforts to address the root causes of this long. As the global custodian of human rights, it is a moment of introspection for this Council. Today's session is the 8th one since the establishment of this body to discuss and address grave human rights abuses of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Continued lack of meaningful accountability of Israel and abundance of expediency and appeasement will further erode the credibility of this global body. We hope the Council would would not belittle the loss of thousands of Palestinian lives, including innocent children and women. We reiterate our call on the Council to demonstrate its credibility and speak with one voice to ensure respect for basic human rights and dignity of the Palestinian people, and ensure meaningful accountability for human rights abuses being perpetrated by Israel in occupied Palestinian territory and beyond. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal on behalf of the European Union by video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The European Union welcomes the ceasefire to bring the violence to an end. We commend Egypt, Qatar, the United States, United Nations and others who have played a facilitating role in this. We deeply regret the loss of life over these 11 days. Both Palestinians and Israelis alike deserve to live in peace and security, enjoying human rights, fundamental freedoms and democracy. Madam President, in previous statements, the European Union has already strongly condemned the indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the Israeli territory, stressing that this is unacceptable and that it must stop. The European Union has also recognized Israel's right to self-defense and has already underlined that this right must be exercised in a proportionate manner and in full respect of international humanitarian law. The European Union's position on the importance of respecting the status quo at the holy sites and upholding the right to worship, as well as on Israel's settlement policy, including in Eastern Jerusalem, and the humanitarian and socio-economic situation in the Gaza Strip is well known. Looking ahead, it is of utmost importance to seize the opportunity to restore a political horizon towards a two-state solution, develop confidence-building measures, improve living conditions for the people, and open the path towards the potential relaunching of the peace process. Only political solution will bring sustainable peace and once for all, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The European Union is united in its commitment to achieving a two-state solution based on parameters set out in the Council conclusions of July 2014, and unilateral decisions that undermine the lasting agreed solution should be avoided. The European Union urges both sides to demonstrate through policies and actions a genuine commitment to a two-state solution in order to rebuild trust and create a path back to meaningful negotiations. The European Union is ready to fully support Israeli and Palestinian authorities in these efforts. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden on behalf of a group of countries by video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. The Nordic countries are deeply concerned over the recent flare-up of violence in Israel and Palestine. We regret the loss of civilian lives, especially the large number of children. We welcome the ceasefire, which must be durable. The indiscriminate and recurrent firing of rockets into Israel by Hamas or any other group in the Gaza Strip is unacceptable and must stop. We recognize Israel's legitimate right to protect itself and its citizens. At the same time, this must be in accordance with international law and obligations under international humanitarian law. The humanitarian and human rights situation in the Gaza Strip remains of grave concern. In order to break the recurring cycle of violence, the root causes of the conflict must be addressed. Settlement expansion, including evictions and demolitions, are illegal under international law and must cease. The status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem must be respected and the rights of worship upheld. Leaders must act responsibly and raise their voice against incitement. It is necessary to mobilize international efforts in support of a credible process towards a two-state solution and an end to the occupation in accordance with international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. The floor is yours.
Madam President, can I please ask the technician to switch on my video?
Yes, we now see you, Ambassador. Please do proceed, Excellency.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I deliver this statement on behalf of the non-aligned. The movement considers with the gravest concern the recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The movement condemns in the strongest terms the acts of aggression by Israel, the occupying power, against the Palestinian civilian population, including attacks on Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the launching on 10th of May of an Israeli military aggression against the Gaza Strip. Recalling the relevant decisions of the NAB ministerial and summit meetings, as well as its declarations, the movement reiterates its demands for an immediate halt to Israeli military aggression and to all acts of violence, provocation, and incitement, including by extremist Israeli settlers, and calls for a scrupulous respect by Israel of international law. The occupying power must also cease all other human rights violations against the Palestinian civilian population, many of which may amount to war crimes. And Israel must fully comply with its duties and responsibilities under international law. Israel must also immediately cease all policies and measures aimed at the alteration of demography, character, identity, and legal status of the occupied territory, including occupied East Jerusalem, as well as all settlement activities, seizure of Palestinian land and properties, demolition of Palestinian homes, expulsion and forced displacement of Palestinian families. The non-aligned movement stresses constitutes the foundation for a just solution of the Palestinian question. The movement calls for action to ensure accountability for all violations perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people. Israel's continued non-compliance with the law warrants collective action in line with the obligations under international law. Madam President, in conclusion, the non-aligned movement reiterates its calls for the immediate end of the Israeli aggression and reaffirms its strong support and solidarity with the just cause of Palestine in their quest to achieve their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including the right to return and the right to self-determination. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa on behalf of the group of African states.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the African group. The African group reiterates the statement made by the chairperson of the African Union Commission on 11 May 2021, strongly condemning the violent attacks in the Al-Aqsa Mosque committed by Israeli security forces and the bombardments in the Gaza Strip, reiterating that these actions, including the continued forced illegal evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, are in stark violation of international law. The African group is appalled by the recent escalation and the deterioration of the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The group condemns the Israeli military aggression against us, which caused the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians, including children and women, injured and displaced thousands, and caused vast destruction of vital infrastructure. The African group welcomes the ceasefire agreement reached following mediation efforts by Egypt in coordination with the UN and calls upon all parties to respect and abide by this agreement. We call upon the international community and in particular the Human Rights Council to take its responsibilities towards the Palestinian people to guarantee their protection in accordance with the international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The African group is of the view that the establishment of an international independent commission of inquiry is necessary and will contribute to putting an end to impunity and ensure accountability. Finally, the African group reiterates its support to the historic struggle of the Palestinian people to the enjoyment of their liberty and rights, including the right of self-determination, as well as their legitimate quest for an independent and sovereign state with East Jerusalem as its capital. it is crucial to emphasize the importance of a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on the existence of two states so as to resolve the longest conflict in recent history and to put an end to the suffering of millions of Palestinians living under occupation. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Mauritania for a video statement.
We express our sincere condolences to the Palestinian people and commend their heroic resistance. My delegation expresses its sincere gratitude leading to the ceasefire. President, the OPT, including East Jerusalem, have in recent days been the theater of an escalation of aggression by the occupiers and extremist Israeli settlers, particularly on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Forced displacement, expropriations, loss of human life are the everyday fate of the scarred Palestinian people. The barbarous aggression by the Israelis have seen all sorts of devastating weapons being used against the unarmed civilians, causing massive destruction of infrastructure, particularly sanitary infrastructure, which has already been fallen foul of a long-standing blockade. All these actions are a grave threat to regional and international peace and security. Mauritania firmly condemns these aggressions against the Palestinian people, its territory. These constitute grave violations of IHL and international human rights law. My delegation demands that the occupying power, Israel, should cease all its violations, in particular its disdain for the sacred nature of the holy shrines and in particular of Al-Aqsa Mosque. In that regard, we reiterate our appeal for the adoption of an effective mechanism to protect the Palestinian people from Israeli aggression. We're profoundly troubled by the acceleration of the Israeli settlement policy, the threats of imminent expulsion of hundreds of Palestinian families from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem. We demand an immediate cessation of all these illegal policies and practices which are a violation by Israel of its obligations under international law. And we call on the international community to stand up to these illegal measures of all forms and swiftly take the necessary measures. My delegation joins those who've called for the establishment of a commission of inquiry to carry out investigations into grave human rights violations perpetrated by Israel. Finally, my delegation reaffirms the steadfast position of my country supporting unreservedly the Palestinian cause and the absolute right of the Palestinian people to create an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Indonesia for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Indonesia welcomed the recent ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel. We call on all parties to refrain from any acts of violence and adhere to the ceasefire agreement. Indonesia notes, however, that a more lasting solution can only be gained when the rights of the Palestinian people are fully protected and respected. The blatant aggression and violation of human rights and humanitarian laws committed by the occupying power, especially in the past month, have led to the death of hundreds of Palestinian civilians, including women and children. In addition, the inhuman and apartheid policies, the demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structure, and forced eviction in the occupied West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, are still ongoing, as Israel believes that it can continue to commit this crime without repercussion. Madam President, we regret that Security Council remain unable to come up with a solution. The failure of international community to protect Palestinian civilians by compelling Israel to observe international law is the reason that we are here today. It is important for today's special session to show that Human Rights Council stand united on the right side of history. The Council should come together to call for an immediate end to violence and cessation of hostility, an immediate and unhindered humanitarian support, and ensuring accountability for human rights violations throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. Additionally, we must also ensure that journalists, humanitarian workers, and human rights defenders working in the conflict area are also protected. Further, we ask Council to take a longer view for means to prevent future recurrence of the atrocities, for example, by establishing temporary international presence to monitor cessation of hostility in the occupied territory of Palestine, and a credible negotiation to achieve a just and comprehensive peace based on two-state solution in line with international agreed parameters. We remain hopeful that this August Council will continue utilize its agenda item 7 in ensuring that human rights of Palestinian people are duly protected and guaranteed. Indonesia will always stand ready to support Palestinian people and all effort aim to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Japan on Zoom. I understand. I'm sorry, Your Excellency, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you.
Devastating human rights and humanitarian situation surrounding Israel. We have seen a large number of civilian casualties on both sides. Japan strongly condemns such acts of violence by all parties and extends its condolences to the victims and their families. In this connection, Japan stresses the importance of protecting civilian facilities, including UN-related sites and humanitarian access to the affected people in Gaza. Japan urges all parties to the conflict to respect international law, including international humanitarian law. Japan also stresses that access to medical treatment, as well as safe and unimpeded passage for medical humanitarian personnel, must be respected in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 2286. Japan welcomes the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Palestinian militants. In addition, Japan supports the mediation efforts by the countries concerned, including the United States and Egypt. Japan strongly hopes that this agreement will lead to a lasting ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and long-term stability and improvement of the human rights situation in the region. Japan has been making diplomatic efforts to ease tensions in the region in cooperation with the international community and will continue to work toward building active role, including in providing emergency humanitarian aid and reconstruction assistance. Japan once again stresses the need for all the parties concerned to continue their efforts to achieve peace based on a two-state solution and to enhance the momentum toward confidence building between Israel and Palestine. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Brazil on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Brazil would like to express its deep concern regarding the latest escalation of violence between Israelis and Palestinians, resulting in the tragic loss of civilian lives, including women and children, as well as injuries of many citizens on both sides. The ceasefire in place is an important and necessary step in avoiding further violence. And Brazil is grateful to the mediation efforts that led to it. Palestinians and Israelis deserve and need to have their human rights respected so that no more pain is inflicted on them. Brazil is hopeful that the parties will engage in the implementation of the commitments agreed upon. Brazil condemns all attacks on civilians for which there can be no justification. We call all parties to respect international humanitarian and human rights law at all times and protecting their infrastructure, including basic services and holy sites. Brazil condemns in the strongest terms the indiscriminate rocket attacks from Gaza towards Israeli population centers by Hamas and other militant groups, which are unacceptable and display a blatant disregard for civilian life. Reports of innocent lives lost and civilian infrastructure damaged by airstrikes in Gaza are of extreme concern, and we call upon Israeli security forces to exercise maximum restraint and to respect international law while exercising Israel's right to self-defense. The clashes between Israelis and Palestinians reveals the persistence of root causes and fundamental issues that need to be resolved. The Human Rights Council bears the responsibility in advancing the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. Although the resolution proposed is not without merit, we believe the establishment of a new commission of inquiry would not, at this time, contribute to sustaining peace and dialogue between the parties. Brazil firmly supports all diplomatic efforts towards a long-term settlement in the region, which accommodates the legitimate concerns of both sides and achieves a just and lasting peace in the secure and internationally recognized borders.
Thank you.
Brazil stands ready to contribute to this endeavor. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation for a video statement.
President, Russia is profoundly moved by the suffering of ordinary people living in Israel and in the Palestinian territories who've become hostages to the latest escalation of the situation in the Middle East. Civilians have again perished, including children. Buildings have been destroyed. Vital infrastructure has been destroyed. We express our condolences to the families of all those who have died and been injured. The latest escalation has dealt a serious blow to human rights, to the human rights of all people living in the region. It's clear that there's no point talking about any promotion and protection of human rights there where you have an open armed conflict going on. It's our belief that the launch pad for rectifying the human rights situation is the ceasefire and reviving efforts in the interests of a political resolution to the conflict. The current escalation in Israel and in Gaza is yet again proof of this. Events in this part of the Middle East are fraught with further escalation and destabilization of the whole region. In that regard, Russia welcomes the ceasefire in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone, where we trust that it will be long-term. We note the mediation mission of Egypt and also the special role played by the Jordanian monarchy with regards the Islamic shrines in Jerusalem, whose status must be observed. Russia, for its part, has been working both with the Israelis and Palestinians, as well as with their neighbors in the region. Now it's important to keep the truce going and to ensure provision of humanitarian supplies to those in need, above all in Gaza. The current escalation makes it patently clear that any attempts to foist unilateral solutions that don't fully factor in the interests of all sides cannot lead to comprehensive stabilization in the Middle East. What's needed is direct Palestinian-Israeli dialogue to resolve fundamental issues on the well-known international legal basis. Russia, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a member of the Quartet, urges our partners to continue energetic collective work to revive direct, constructive Palestinian-Israeli dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Bolivia on Zoom.
Gracias, señor. Bolivia.
Thank you.
La comisión por el informe dado, así como los demás graduados.
Like Bolivia condemns the recent attacks against Palestinian people It's a grave military aggression by the occupying power Israel against civilians in Gaza, leading to the deaths of hundreds of Palestinians, including children and civilians. We state our profound concern at recent events. The quality of the sound is very poor, says the interpreter.
Señora Presidenta, con mucha impotencia, testigos cotidianos de la justicia a la que están siendo sometidos el pueblo político por parte a través de agresiones militares.
Military aggression, the settlement policy of Israel run counter to international humanitarian law and international law, as well as respective UN resolutions. It's necessary to make it clear, well, there are two parties to this conflict. Bolivia, they're not in equal conditions. You have the occupying power, Israel on the one hand, and Palestine on the other. There's a historic, undeniable inequality. One party uses force to occupy another's territory, to forcibly displace civilians, expropriate land, establish illegal settlements, and block supplies of humanitarian aid, and has launched a brutal military campaign against the Palestinian people. One party is clearly violating its international obligations. Furthermore, the Palestinian people in Gaza have no refuge, no place to escape to. Women, children, the elderly live in terror without hope of seeing a swift solution to help live them in peace. Lasting solution, and again the sound has gone out.
Con expresiones claras de voluntad política de ambas que ponga fin a la ocupación ilegal en un Estado palestino libre.
The quality of the audio is not good enough to be interpreted.
67, con Jerusalén Oriental como su capital, de conformidad con las resoluciones pertinentes del Consejo de Seguridad y la Asamblea General. Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, and I do apologize to both the interpreters and the delegations for the quality of the sound. It may be because we are using a new room. This is not, of course, the Assembly Hall, but we are trying to rectify the problem, and apologies again. I now give the floor to Bahrain for a video statement.
Thank you, President. First of all, my delegation would like to align with the statements delivered by the regional and political groups it's a member of. We reiterate our support for summoning this special session of the Human Rights Council. We urge the UN from this rostrum to assume its legal, ethic and humanitarian responsibilities to ensure respect for human rights consistent with the decisions regarding the Middle East and guaranteeing protection for the Palestinian people, also to intensify efforts towards reaching lasting peace in the region. We reiterate the position of our steadfast position towards the kindred Palestinian people and our firm repudiation of the dangerous cycle of escalation and violence, as well as our repudiation of military operations carried out in the OPT, particularly in Gaza, which has led to the hundreds of people being killed, wounded, demolition of infrastructure. We condemn violations of the rights of the Palestinian people, particularly in the port and in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, where there have been expropriations of Palestinian property. We welcome Arab and international efforts, particularly those by Egypt, to reach a ceasefire and to hold negotiations between the two parties in order to put an end to military operations in Gaza and to guarantee provision of aid, humanitarian aid, to the inhabitants of Gaza. In conclusion, we call for us all to pull together to achieve peace and security in the region for this long-suffering region, and we reiterate the need to revive the peace process to reach a lasting solution to the Palestinian question based on the Palestinian people having their legal rights restored, in particular through establishing a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital on the basis of the two-state solution. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to India for a video statement.
President, India remains committed to global promotion and protection of human rights, which are best pursued through dialogue and cooperation amongst the states. India welcomes the diplomatic efforts of the international community and regional countries that have resulted in bringing ceasefire between Israel and armed groups in Gaza. India calls on all parties to show extreme restraint, desist from actions that aggravate tensions, and refrain from any further attempts to unilaterally change the existing status quo, including in East Jerusalem and its neighborhoods. We remain concerned about the continuing violence in Jerusalem, especially at Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, and other Palestinian territories, and about the possible eviction process in Sheikh Jarrah and Silvan neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, an area which is part of an arrangement facilitated by the UN. The indiscriminate rocket firings from Gaza, targeting the civilian population in Israel, which we have condemned, and the retaliatory airstrikes into Gaza in the last 2 weeks have caused immense suffering and resulted in deaths, including that of an Indian national. We deeply mourn the loss of civilian lives resulting from the violence and urge the international community's immediate attention to providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian civilian population, particularly in Gaza. India continues to provide developmental and humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian Authority, including COVID-19 related assistance, bilaterally and through our dedicated contribution to the UN. India remains convinced that dialogue remains the only viable option that can effectively address the issues confronting the region and its people. Recent developments have once again underscored the need for immediate resumption of dialogue between Israel and Palestine, aimed at realizing the establishment of two states living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Argentina on Zoom.
Argentina da la bienvenida al alto el fuego anunciado y hace un llamado pasado y hace un llamado a todos los actores a respetar.
Your Excellency, please stop. The sound is not good. Let's try again. And if... Shall we try again? You have the floor.
Sí. Argentina da la bienvenida al alto al fuego anunciado el 20 de mayo pasado y hace un llamado a todos los actores al sufrimiento causado por estas.
Your Excellency, we're still getting a very bad sound. Please just give us a few seconds to see what the problem is.
Gracias, sin